David, it's great to be here with you. Actually, it feels like we may have actually been in this same room a few years back.
I think so, yeah.
Here in Las Vegas. So, David, what is new in David Mahdi world? What are you working on these days?
That's a great question. About 7 months ago, I left Gartner and going off doing advisory work, but I'm still in the PKI space, still helping clients out, still advising them. But here, today, I know we're here in Las Vegas, here for the Gartner Identity and Access Management Summit. I have to say I was quite proud going around the show floor, seeing the Venafi booth, seeing Key Factors, seeing others, and seeing machine identity management as well in the Gartner sessions. It's on the hype cycle, which I helped to put it there. So I felt very proud that something that I contributed to with the research, the advisory work, and a lot of stuff, frankly, that Venafi also pioneered. You guys were certainly ahead of your time, and having talked to so many clients out there, just raw conversations, and they're like, what is this machine identity management? Why is it important? So what I'm doing now is just continuing to evangelize it, Kevin, continuing to move it along, but from a different perspective now, so yeah.
And what gets you excited these days?
What gets me excited is, again, I think, not to sound so cliche, but again, the rapid pace of change. I think this decade started out with the pandemic, and we panicked. And many organizations had to leap forward 5 to 7 years, according to Deloitte and others like Gartner, digitally, because they had to, whether it be secure access programs, really investing in zero trust. And many of them now are realizing that identity is the core foundation, both for humans, but also for machines. So I think we're crossing that chasm now, and really, if I bring it back to machine identity management, CyberArk says 45 times. There are 45 times more machine identities than there are human identities, and 68% of them have access to very sensitive information. This is a ticking time bomb for a lot of organizations, and I can tell you that, having had over 6,000 engagements with clients over the years, many of them had the tools and some process for PKI keys, certificates. But I think we're entering a new phase, Kevin, as this goes forward. So that's what excites me, is seeing this change, and now seeing, when you mention machine identity management, when you mention the criticality of cryptography, people are lighting up, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot more I can say there.
We'll get into that.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think, our recent research shows that they're, from CIO's perspective, that they already see in an average Global 5,000, at least 240,000 machine identities, growing at 40% year over year. I mean, I like to talk about it that we, the humans, are pretty boring. There are only so many customers, there are only so many team members that you can have join, acquire. But wow, just since we've been talking here, the number of machines, cloud instances, Kubernetes clusters, probably just have, multiplied in numbers just since we've been here. Yeah. So that journey to machine identity management, though, it was new when we first talked about it. That idea that there are two actors on a network out on the cloud, that there are people and there are machines. And people, humans, we use usernames, passwords, but machines have different identities. What did you first see in machine identity management that this was going to be important, going to be required, and that CISOs, CIOs needed to understand it?
It's a great point. I mean, the notion of identity and access management is primarily all been focused on humans. $25 billion market over the next couple of years, and even again at this Gartner conference that we're at, the bulk of it's all human stuff. But as you mentioned, those sheer numbers and the volume and velocity of machine identities, right? This is just going to continue to grow and expand. So there are some practices that we can and should borrow from human identity management and start to bring it in, right? Governance, authorization, all the exactly. But obviously it's different, right? I mean, these things can be very ephemeral. As I mentioned, the volume and velocity is at a different level. So I think, we're entering a new phase where, first of all, there's still some education that still needs to be done. And frankly, I think, Kevin, I should also just take a moment here to define what machines are. What do we mean when we say them, right? Because you hear some terms, some of the cloud infrastructure entitlements management vendors, Sonra, Hermetic, they talk about non-human identities or non-person identities. Well, what are they, right? The Gartner definition is they can be devices, mobile devices, IoT, OT, laptops, servers, workloads, containers, as you mentioned, virtual machines, all these types of things, and then bots with RPA.
Or a smart contract on the blockchain.
You got it, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Software, right,
Yes.
with code. So all of these things need identities, but the market and the practitioners, they just weren't thinking of it this way.
Right. We are humans. We, go figure, we
Yeah.
think about ourselves as being important. We understand
Definitely do.
ourselves as humans.
Yeah.
The machine world, what does a Kubernetes cluster look like? Or, wow, what does even a virtualized infrastructure look like? And that's new to identity and access professionals.
It's very new. I mean, I think much like most of what we've done in the evolution of computing is we always leap forward and then we discover the problems after, right? So there's still many problems, even within the realm of machine identity management, that are still unknown as we embark on this journey. But I think as organizations start to see, as I mentioned, the CyberArk quote, 68% of these machines, these workloads and containers, there's sensitive information in there. And unfortunately, as you and I both know, because we've been in cybersecurity for a long time, right, both of us, we've seen this story play out many times before where a breach will have to happen in order for the market to move. So what I was trying to do with my counterpart, Eric Wallstrom, who's at Gartner, when we were looking at all these problems, we started to see some early elements of it, certainly with the PKI and certificates, but as you know, it was just certificate management and PKI operations. Okay. But it was actually kind of IoT that started becoming something of interest, where you look at IoT and go, you can't treat it like a mobile device and you can't treat it like a human identity. This is different. And so that was like the precursor to then looking at all these other ephemeral elements, which are pure software, containers and workloads, and saying, okay, the thought process of going through how you would do governance and management on the IoT side, we now need to start thinking about all these very fast-moving, ephemeral, other types of machines, which is why now it's important to look at the holistic definition of machine identity management.
Right. So it's really important, I think, is for identity and access management professionals, as they think about what makes a machine identity different than a human identity. You touched on some of them.
Yep.
What do you think are some of the really important differences?
That's a great question. I once had a client that asked me if they could use a PIV card, a government CAC card, for a machine, right? And I said, well, what kind of machine? And they said it was a bot. I'm like, the bot doesn't have hands, right?
And I chuckle about that, but it's a very valid question, though, because also we see why can't I use a username and password only?
Yep.
So it is something I think that as professionals get to understand. They understand why it's a valid question, but also why it's a question that needs to be asked differently for machines.
Absolutely. Look, I think, Kevin, I put together this digital trust architecture, right? Everything today is digital business, but you can't have digital business unless you have digital trust. And how do we instill trust in the digital world? It's with cryptography, keys and certificates. I do not include passwords in that because that is not strong, and we all know we could throw out a million different stats of how weak that is and how that can really open up an organization. And there's countless attacks where bad actors will steal credentials, usernames and passwords, use them to get in. Effectively, they're weaponizing digital trust against you. But these machines, we've had the technology for a long time. PKI, whether it's asymmetric keys or symmetric keys, to be able to use for all those machines that I mentioned in that definition, from hardware, IoT, OT, all the way down to these containers. It's a very appropriate way. And even going back to that client's question, when you look at PIV or those CAC cards, it's all PKI under the hood. So I said, look, it might sound like a silly question when you're thinking about it from a hardware, physical perspective, but when you look at the plumbing of what's behind the scenes of CAC cards and PIV cards, it's PKI. Mm-hmm. So it's like you could maybe use a derived certificate for that entity, right. And remember that entity can exist for a day, a week, a year, a second, 5 seconds, and you need to be able to revoke it and do all that
so then some of those differences, human versus machine identity, you've got they're ephemeral, they're They could be short-lived,
Yep.
or actually on the flip side, they could be very long-lived.
Yes.
They live out there with applications, with the machines.
Yeah. Yeah.
Human identities, we have generally one directory or one identity service in the cloud, but there can be lots of sources too. That's
Yep.
another difference with machine identities. And they live out there with applications. Of course, too, they have a life cycle that's different.
Yes.
They need to be manufactured. They might need to be recycled, renewed.
Yes.
And that might happen at a very different scale and time frame. I mean, we've been talking here, I might have needed 10,000 machine identities for my Kubernetes workloads. But then 5 minutes later, I don't need them. They need to be recycled.
Yeah.
So,
Kevin, I love that point. It's a very important point to say that all of this is extremely dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And organizations aren't used to they're not going to have 10,000 humans join the organization right now at this hour and then 20 minutes later leave the organization, right? So again, if you look at the overall life cycle of an identity, human or machine, there's certain elements that are applicable in the machine world, but as you and I both know, that volume, the velocity, the variety, and the different types of identity stores and how all this works, it's very complicated, but we do absolutely have to get our heads around it. Because these, as you mentioned, these workloads, containers, and these machines are going to play a fundamental role as the world continues to digitally transform. So that's why I'm excited, because the transformation's still happening. Mm-hmm. And I know you and I, the work that we've done over the years to help build machine identity management, I'm very proud to see now we're starting to see organizations, the light bulbs going off. They see identity as an attack surface. We're protecting humans, but I think we now need to start investing in the people, the process, and the technology of machine identity management.
Still have questions? Turn to Venafi, the machine identity experts. Check out our channel or visit venafi.com to learn about all things encryption, certificate management, and more.